Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een, amma ba'd. Begin by asking Allah to make us learn beneficial knowledge and allow for that knowledge to penetrate into our minds and into our hearts and to transform us. And as I always like to remind myself and remind my audience, we ask Allah to help to temporarily at least remove our attention deficit disorder that we have when it comes to listening to Islamic lectures. Ameen. So I want to start by telling you a sad story. It's a sad story, but unfortunately it's a true story. It's a story of some Muslim students just like yourselves who were in college. And these Muslim students, they were somewhat practicing Muslims. They used to go to conferences. Maybe they actually came to the MSA West conference last year or a few years ago perhaps. And these Muslims, they witnessed oppression, much like you're witnessing in the world. They're not the average person who's sitting there being brainwashed by Fox News or whatever else it may be. These are people who could see beyond the propaganda that's out there. So they saw systematic oppression taking place, particularly recently when it came to the events taking place in Syria with the regime. They witnessed the hypocrisy of the Western nations, which claim to be the liberators of all the world and the people who are the international policemen and for justice and human rights and all of these things. They witnessed that hypocrisy, that them doing nothing. They witnessed the stupidity of perhaps some of the scholars who were actually aiding the regime in allowing them to kill and maim and displace other people. They saw all of that and they witnessed all of this. They witnessed 9 million Syrian refugees being displaced and kicked out of their homes and having to flee from their homes and living in camps, refugee camps, in the dilapidated, horrible conditions that no human being should ever have to live in. So these Muslims, what did they do? They rose up. Exactly what our conference title is, right? They rose up to the occasion. And they said, I'm going to leave my comfortable weather of Southern California with the beaches and all that. They're from here. And they went to Turkey. They flew over there and they joined some humanitarian relief effort or whatever it may be. And they went into the humanitarian camps. They went into those camps, refugee camps. And they said, we can at least deliver some water. We can at least help distribute some food, help distribute some medicine to these people who are suffering. In fact, our brothers and sisters, mainly, who are suffering over here. So these people rose up and they wanted to make a change in the lives of these people. And their intention was that they wanted to do something. They wanted to help. And also, they realized that, you know what, Islam also teaches us these things to do that. Keep in mind the order. They wanted to help, and they also remembered that Islam taught them to go ahead and help as well. So now what happened? They saw from being in Southern California, comfortable life, drinking Starbucks or Coffee Bean or whenever you feel like it, going ahead to any restaurant whenever you feel like it, going and living that life and seeing the conditions of the people that are living there. They saw the conditions. They saw the people. They saw the children who were suffering, the people who were dying. And at the same time, they saw Christian missionaries also doing humanitarian work in the exact same camps, sometimes more organized than the Muslims. They saw liberal activists who believed in La ilaha. That's it. They only believe in La ilaha. There is no God. Agnostics or atheists. But they're out there and they're helping people. And they're making a change in these lives, and sometimes they are more organized than the Muslims. And at the same time, they witness the hypocrisy of the Muslims who are living in palaces, bathing themselves in the wealth that they're getting from the oil money that they're selling around the world, that they didn't even do anything to actually earn that. And they're witnessing all of this. And what starts to happen? This is a true story. What starts to happen? Some of these activists, doesn't mean the majority, doesn't mean all of them, some of them, a significant group of them, they start praying less and less. As time goes by, their prayers start decreasing. As time goes by, they start asking the same questions that the skeptics around them are asking them. He said, what kind of God allows these type of things to happen? Why does God allow this type of evil to happen? And they start questioning themselves. They start thinking, what's going on over here? So they start getting influenced by the environment, and as time went on and went on, a significant group of them decided that they wanted to leave Islam. And this news reached me, that they actually left Islam. Now I want you to think about that for a moment, and I want you to ask yourself the question, why? Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to guide whom He wills. Allah knows what's in the hearts of all people. But what are some of the factors, what are some of the lessons that we can learn for ourselves to understand how we can prevent ourselves from going down the same path and going down the same road, starting out with an intention of altruism, trying to help other people, and ending up in those circumstances. From their perspective, what was the issue? We'll discuss that. But they left Islam because they were not rooted. They rose up, but they were not rooted. And the title of this conference is what? Rooted in rising up. It's not just rising up. You got to have roots. And this is exactly what happened, is that when we analyze their circumstances, when we look at their background, when we look at what they were doing, we look at their motives, their niyyah, their intention behind all of this, we saw that there was something missing in those roots. And that's why this conference is extremely important. Whoever titled it, well, I think was a genius. Rooted in rising up, and it goes both ways. You rise up and you get yourself rooted, you get rooted and then you rise up. It goes both ways. And here's the thing, from their perspective, they took comfort in the idea that they're just helping people, so they're still good people. They're just being a good person. Their new religion now is they follow the golden rule. Do unto others as you would want being done to yourself. That is sufficient for many people. The people who believe in La ilaha, but not the people who believe in La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. So there's a major lesson, but you go back and you look at that and you say, what was their goal? Their goal was social justice. We need to achieve social justice. The goal was elimination of oppression. These were the goals. And I've actually heard people, I'm telling you honestly, I was in MSA. When I was in the MSA, actually MSU from UCLA, we're the exceptions to the rule. At that time, I remember there was protests for Palestine going on. And one of the brothers who was organizing the protest, I remember this word, and I'll never forget these words. And we were there, we were protesting. And I'll never forget these words. He says, I want you guys to remember that all the students who are joining us today from the non-Muslim different groups that are out there, I want you to remember, our job is not to try to guide them. And I'll tell you the exact words that he used. Our job is not to guide them. Our job is to utilize them in order to free the people of Palestine. And I said, Subhanallah, what an understanding of Islam. What kind of understanding of Islam is that the end goal is simply liberation. The end goal is only social justice. The end goal is only freedom from oppression. But if you look at it purely from an Islamic perspective, what was last year's MSA West conference titled? Does anyone know? Islamic state of mind. Islamic state of mind, Islamic worldview, thinking within an Islamic framework, within an Islamic paradigm. It's extremely different. You see, in an Islamic paradigm, from the Islamic perspective, everything we do, every action that we have in this life is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's to fulfill a preset purpose that has been defined for us before we were even born and before we arrived on this earth. A very different perspective, and freedom from oppression, and helping other people, and establishing social justice, and giving in charity. These are all goals to an ultimate objective and an ultimate end. And when we begin to lose that focus, when we start thinking that we're not going to be able to achieve these things, therefore what's the point of Islam? That's when we're outside of an Islamic framework. That's when we're outside of an Islamic frame of mind. So we need to go back. We need to remember that yes, Islam teaches giving charity will help redistribute wealth in the society. It will help achieve social justice. But all these things are part of a larger plan that our Creator, the Creator of us and the entire universe and the multiverse, whatever dimension, through whatever black hole, there are all the black holes that are there, every galaxy that we know of and that we don't know of, the Creator and the Sustainer and the one who's in control of all of those things had a larger plan than what us feeble, small, humble human beings can see. And He taught us that in the Quran. He taught us that in the message of Islam. And that is what we need to understand as Muslims. We need to remember that we need to be rooted firmly in Islam, rooted firmly in an Islamic mentality, rooted firmly in understanding that, you know what, my purpose in life and everything that I do is going to come from the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined it, the way that my Creator defined it. And these roots, it's not just one root. It's not just one thing. It's not just one focus. So if you looked at that picture, how many roots were going down into the ground? Not just one, several. You need several roots to keep that foundation strong. So the same thing when it comes to Islam, we need to realize that we don't just pick and choose certain verses which fall into the paradigm or the type of framework that we want to live our lives, or that we feel is the most relevant or the most beneficial. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught us these different things across the board, Islam should become in a comprehensive way. We don't just pick and choose hadith and we say we're going to go ahead and shape Islam the way we want by focusing only on this or focusing only on that. And most of you know exactly what I'm talking about, because those of you who've been practicing for a little bit longer, you've met other Muslims. And you find some Muslims, they focus on dress only. It's all about, if you ain't wearing the kurta, if you ain't wearing the thobe, akhi, then what's going to happen to you? You got to change. You got to use the miswak. They focus on this, they focus on that. They focus on one aspect. But then there's other people that focus on aqidah. It's all about aqidah. It's all about your iman. It's all about your belief. It's all about your belief. And then they maybe tend to neglect something else. Then there are other people who talk about Islamic State. We got to develop an Islamic State, not a state of mind only. Islamic State. Halal one, not the ISIS one, right? The real Islamic State. We got to develop that. We got to bring the Khilafah back. We got to bring that. Yeah, that's all good. That's all part of a plan. But when you neglect everything else and you only want to focus on that, you're not taking Islam in the actual way. Some people only focus on spirituality. Just improve your relationship with your Creator. Everything else is going to be solved. People are dying over there. Just make some more dhikr. Just do some more tasbih. You know, everything's going to be okay. And then there are some people who focus only on activism. Some people who only focus on the things that happen to line up with humanistic or liberal values. And anything outside of that framework or outside of that scope is considered to be something that we don't need to focus on. But you know what, brothers and sisters, where does the root cause of this problem lie? I feel one hypothesis that I have is because the generation, my generation and your generation, we grew up witnessing from the previous generation of Muslims that they tend to focus on prayer and they focus on fasting and they focus on Islam. For them is, you got to make sure you get the nikah, done inside the masjid with the imam and everything. You got to make sure that you got to eat halal food. But when it comes to all the other aspects of Islam being a comprehensive way of life, it was something that was not there. It was something that was seen very, very narrowly. It was seen that you need to parrot some ritualistic formulas that are devoid of real substance. And that's what Islam stands for. So alhamdulillah, some of the Muslims have woken up and they say, no, Islam is greater than that. Islam is more broad than that. Islam is a complete way of life. It teaches you how to go to the bathroom. It teaches you how to make wudu. It teaches you how to get married. It teaches you how to liberate people from oppression. It teaches you how to establish a true leadership. It teaches you how to alleviate poverty. It's a whole system. Everything. And teaches you how to pray to your Lord and connect with your Creator. But at the same time, what some people have done is when they discovered all those other aspects, they threw out the baby with the bathwater. They said, this is the focus that no one has been focusing on. And all this prayer and all this fasting and this other stuff that's been the previous generation have been focusing on, that's secondary. That's secondary. We'll deal with all of that stuff later. We're going to go ahead and we're going to make sure that Islam is focusing on all these other aspects. And this is what we don't want. We don't want to become Muslim socialists. We don't want to conflate liberal values with Islamic values, even though there's a major overlap between the two. And I'm saying this, and I hope you can understand what I'm saying. For some of you, maybe it's like, well, what are you talking about, liberal values and this and that? Something, just reflect upon this. If you conflate the two, meaning if you mix the two up, and you think that this, helping people, doing this, doing that, is equivalent to Islam and not just a part and parcel of Islam within a greater framework, then we have a major misunderstanding of what Islam really stands for. It's something we need to reevaluate and go back and say, why did Allah create us in the first place? What was the purpose behind all of this? So we need to understand Islam in a greater framework, in a larger way of understanding things, right? So if we think Islam is just a tool that's going to accomplish some little tiny objective that we've defined ourselves as achieving, whether it's about liberating Palestine, whether it's about eliminating poverty, whether it's about empowering women, and we say we're going to utilize Islam in that framework, but if it's not achieved in our lifetime, we're going to get stressed out. If it's not achieved for some reason, we're going to get upset and start blaming Islam and saying Islam as a system is something wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with Islam. There may be something wrong with our understanding of Islam. There may be something wrong with our perception of what Islam is supposed to be, and we try to redefine it into something different. Because if we have that mentality that Islam is just a tool to achieve something that we have set out to achieve, no matter how noble the goal may be, then if you go and read the Quran, you will think that Prophet Musa alayhi salam failed in his mission because they didn't enter the promised land, because his people didn't want to get up and fight. But if you study the tafsir, if you study the explanation of the Quran, you study in a greater context, you understand that this was part of the plan of Allah. This was part of Prophet Musa's test. This was part of what Prophet Musa had to do to prepare for other people. If you understand Islam in this narrow framework, you think that Hamza was a failure because he died in the battle of Uhud where Muslims lost the battle. Just because he didn't live to see the success afterwards doesn't mean that it was a failure, because we have narrowed our vision sometimes. So you need to be cautious about this. You need to be very careful about this, and you need to go back and build your roots. And what are your roots? Your roots are the sources of Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah. Some of you may have heard this a lot. Some of you may have not heard it enough. We got to remember that everything that we stand for should be contained in the Quran and Sunnah, and we should allow that to shape us and not allow us to shape these sources, even though there's an interpretive factor involved in there. So when it comes to these things, build your roots, but understand that the Quran and Sunnah are not living sources. As one scholar said, you can't just go to the Quran and ask it a question. It's not going to give you an answer. You can't go to a hadith and say, can you tell me what you really meant by that? You could have done that when the Prophet ﷺ was alive, but you can't do that today. So what does that mean? There's an added layer of effort that needs to be there so that we understand these sources in the correct way. And we not parrot slogans again by saying Quran and Sunnah, Quran and Sunnah, Quran and Sunnah, and you don't even know what the Quran and Sunnah is. Either you didn't read them or you read them in a vacuum, taking everything completely out of context. So I'm just going to give you one example so this doesn't sound purely theoretical. This is a common example because I deal with this stuff on a daily basis. People come to me and I see online and I get email questions from around the world and people ask me these questions. So here's a hadith. Tell me if you've heard this hadith. Raise your hand if you know it. This is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said in a nutshell that if you pass gas, unless you smell it or you hear it, don't leave your prayer because your wudu is not broken. Who's heard this hadith before? Okay. Decent number of people. Now check this out. Check this out. So there's a bunch of people, and I'm taking a very small example. There's a bunch of people who pass gas regularly while they're praying, or even before they're praying. Okay, they make wudu and they pass gas, and what do? A little bit of a crude example. They smell. Nope. Didn't hear it, and I didn't smell it. So you know what? I still got my wudu. And they know for a fact that they pass gas. But this was their understanding of the hadith. And this is not what the hadith was talking about. The hadith was actually talking about, according to consensus of scholars, is that when someone's got a stomach upset, right? They've got a problem with their stomach and is gurgling, and they think maybe, they have a doubt, right? Maybe something came out. He's giving you the advice, when you have a doubt and you're confused and you're becoming skeptical, you're becoming obsessive compulsive when it comes to these type of things, then in that case, that small little doubt, just ignore the doubt unless you have certainty that something happened by smelling or by hearing it. That's the way that it works. You don't just pass gas and continue your prayer. Now, can you imagine if this is what we're talking about in wudu? Can you imagine someone misunderstanding a hadith about political implications? Maybe resulting in the death of somebody, maybe resulting in the divorce or the marriage or the zina of somebody. Can you imagine what it could mean to misinterpret all these different things that the Quran or the Prophet, peace be upon him, said? It's extremely dangerous. So we need to be very, very careful about this. So my advice to you is to make sure that you understand Islam in its correct context. You make sure that whatever you do, every single thing that you do is going to be rooted in the worship of Allah, in the understanding of what Islam is in its true form, and ask yourself the question. Everything you do, ask yourself, is this what Allah really wants me to do? Just go back and ask yourself, is this what Allah wants me to do? And then ask yourself the second question. Is this the priority that Allah wants me to do right now? If Israel invades Gaza and is slaughtering people, right now, does Allah want me to put my effort in to fighting for the lab rats that are being abused in the universities while people are being slaughtered? Priorities. Understand what takes precedence in your life. If it's time to protest and the time for your prayer is going, do you say, you know what? We can pray later. We can pray qada, right? It's okay. Let's go and protest. Which one takes precedence? And how do you decide? You decide from the framework that Allah has taught you. So understand Islam at its core. And let me tell you a story a survey. When people lose their values, when people can't see the difference between this value and that value, you have chaos in society. There was a survey that took place in Europe about a few decades ago, among the intelligent class, the educated intellectual classes of people in Western Europe, the enlightened thinkers and all of that. And they said, here's a question for you. If there was a museum with all famous artwork and it's burning down, the museum is on fire and it's burning down, and you're inside the museum, you're about to get out, and you see that there's the last Van Gogh painting, original, that is in the world, priceless painting of Van Gogh, right there. And you can get up and grab it and take it out and save it. There's only one in the entire world, priceless. And there's a little baby crying. But you can only pick up one of these things because the building is about to burn down. Over 50% of these intellectuals, they made the argument that there's only one Van Gogh painting. But there's many babies out there, and more babies will come and be produced. So I would go and save the painting. And this is exactly what happens to people's moral values when you fall into a relativistic way of thinking. Your mind, shaitan can trick you, your mind can trick itself when you don't have the guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you need to go back to that guidance, and you need to make sure that you're rooted. You need to make sure that you have an understanding. And I'll conclude with a story from the hadith, from the Prophet, peace be upon him. He said there was a group of, there's a story. It's a hadith. He said there's a group of companions. Got 2 minutes? 1 minute. I'll handle this. There's a group of companions going down. They're on a journey. A rock falls off the mountain and hits one of the companions in the head. So what does he do? He wraps a this is an authentic hadith, by the way. He wraps a band-aid around his head. He's injured. So they start traveling. They go to sleep. They wake up in the morning for Fajr. And this guy, this is the worst time for the guy. He happened to have a wet dream that night. Horrible time for a wet dream. This guy wakes up, and what does he have to do now? He has to make ghusl. He has to take an entire bath before he can pray Fajr prayer. And it's freezing cold, and he's got a wound on his head and is bandaged. So he goes to the companions and he asked them, he said, hey, guys got an exception for me? You guys are a little bit more knowledgeable than me. Is there an exception? And they said, you know what? Allah commanded you. You got to wash your entire body. It's in the Quran. You got to wash everything. So there's no exception for you. So he went in there, took off the band-aid, wound is healing a little bit. And at that time, they used to shower out of like buckets, you know, like in third world countries, they still do the same thing. Scoop up the bucket, pour the water over his head. Water went straight into his head, into the wound, fell down, died. We just lost a Sahabi. We just lost a companion. They went back to the Prophet ﷺ after the incident took place and after they returned from their journey. And they told him what happened. And you know what he said? He said, they killed him. They meaning the people who gave answers without knowledge, they killed him. And then he said, if they don't know, why don't they ask? Asking is the cure for ignorance. إنما شفاء العي السؤال. The cure for ignorance is to ask the question, meaning to learn, to understand. And then he said it would have been sufficient if he just wiped some water over his bandage and he would have been good to go. So here's the thing. If we don't understand what Islam really stands for in a proper way, we're going to put ourselves in the worst danger that we can do. Everything we do in our life, if it's not rooted in a correct understanding of what Islam is, we put our world and we put our akhirah in danger. So take it very seriously. If you want to take Islam seriously, you want to be an awesome Muslim, and inshallah, you're all awesome Muslims, learn your deen. Put some time, 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day. And if you got more time than that, here's my little last plug. Join a college that we started called the College of Islamic Studies. You could take classes while you're going to school, because I had a ton of questions. I had a ton of things I wanted to learn, and I wish I had something where I could, while I'm taking classes, I could just take one class on the side and actually learn my deen, learn my Islam while I'm going to college, revolutionize the MSA, revolutionize my activism, revolutionize my work, revolutionize my family, change everything. So this is exactly what we did. We put up all the recorded videos online. We got exams, we got questions, and you could watch it in the comfort of your own home from your own cell phone. Just go to collegeislam.com. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to liberate us from ignorance. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help and guide us, all of us, on the straight path without ever wavering from it. We ask Allah to cure our hearts and to guide our hearts and to guide our minds to that which pleases Allah. Ameen. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wassalamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.